Today is June 11th, 2007. This is the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies at Yale University, and my name is Joanne Rudolph.
I'm Dana Klein.
My name is Sam Weisberg, and before I go into my testimony, I would like to say this. I'm grateful to Yale and to the Bergen Belsen Association for having the foresight of the necessity to preserve the testimonies of whoever is left. I'm almost 80 years old now, and I would sincerely thank you, ladies, who participate in it. And thanks to Mark and Anita Lichtblau, who accompanied us as nephew and niece, although they're not related to us. They took the time, leaving two little kids at home, to come and be witness. And now I'm ready.
Okay, if you could start by telling us where you were born and when, and just talk about your early memories.
I was born in those days, it was known in German as Königshütte, in Polish, Królewska Huta. And in later years, because it was more Polonized, it became Chorzow. It is a town that was originally German before 1918, but it was annexed into Poland according to the peace agreement. And the streetcar that runs even today, because we recently visited there, the streetcar runs and did run at that time through a border, which was Germany and Poland, and every half an hour it came to the border. The police changed from Polish to German and vice versa. And so I personally was exposed to a lot of German because my governess, who practically brought me up, spoke only German because the family she came from was originally German before Poland took over. And my parents had a ready-to-wear store in Chorzow, and I attended a school. I think I finished 4 grades.
What year were you born in?
I was born in 1927. And just prior to the war in 1939, because of the wealth that my parents had, they were considered as a risk to be at the border, and they got a polite invitation to move away from the border. And that was more or less either you go or we will send you away. And so my parents gave the business over to a sister of my mother's and rented an apartment in Krakow. We went to that particular summer, my mother, myself, my aunt, and her daughter went to Krynica, which is a summer resort. And sometimes by the end of the summer, my father and my uncle were alarmed enough about the Polish military being requested to get the people that had to be on post back into post and so on. They called Krynica and told us to get back to Krakow because the situation was getting very, very serious.
Were you an only child?
I became an only child about 1936. I had a younger brother who died from a very simple to cure sickness nowadays, diphtheria, which is a throat infection. Had it then had any penicillin or anything, an antibiotic, unfortunately that wasn't available, and with all that my parents tried bringing in doctors from Krakow and from Vienna even. He passed away after suffering for about 3 weeks. So yes, I became the only child at the time. To go back to 1939, within a day after we arrived from Krynica, the first bombs fell on Krakow, and the war was on. And my parents immediately knew that the Germans are going to, and they did proceed crossing the border and so on. We got a horse and buggy in Wieliczka, just 20 kilometers out of Krakow, and start with the horse and buggy towards the east. And after about 4 or 5 days with the horse and buggy, we wound up in Zaleszczyki. And that is the Romanian border between Poland and Romania. And the reason we picked that town is because a cousin of my mother's was married to Rabbi Steinberg, who was the rabbi for all Polish military, and his seat was in that little town. In fact, on the second day after we arrived, a Polish officer and 2 soldiers arrived with a truck and took Rabbi Steinberg, his wife, and the daughter through Romania. And Rabbi Steinberg begged my mother, "Come with us. I am the officer in charge. I can take you." Unfortunately, my mother decided that her sisters were still in Poland and she wouldn't leave. So we stayed in that little town until the Russians came in and occupied it. We, within a week or so, moved to a larger city, which was Lvov or Lemberg. And I attended school under Stalin for about 8 or 10 months.
In what language?
Well, this is odd. I never spoke Yiddish, but in Lvov, the communists in their wisdom thought that it's better not to antagonize the Jewish population, so they left one school known as 88 Shkola, the 88th school, the Jewish 88th school, which taught me Yiddish, Ukrainian because Lvov became Ukraine, and naturally Russian because they were the liberators, so we had to learn 3 languages. And I still remember some of it. However, it didn't take long. Less than a year later, Hitler decided that that was all that he needed time to reorganize, and he attacked Stalin, and the rest is history. We stayed in Lvov and eventually made our way back towards Krakow, where my mother's sisters were. And yes, after meeting up with the sisters, one of them had a brother-in-law in a small town called Wolbrom, just north of Krakow, halfway to Warsaw. And the reason we picked or decided to go there was because that brother-in-law had a bakery. And everyone was concerned, will we have bread enough? And so I wound up in Wolbrom. And I'd like to tell the story as why did I speak English before I was liberated? My mother was a very smart, not just because she had me, but my mother was a very smart business lady. And she talked in 4 other sets of parents in Wolbrom who were well-to-do. They had a few zlotys and had some possibly gold and silver, and that they had brought with them. Some were local people too. A couple of them were local kids. And she has talked them into the fact that if we ever survive this war, there's three necessities. You need to know English, you need to know mathematics, and possibly geography. And she found a man who used to be a university professor, the Hebrew university professor in Krakow, who was starving practically in Wolbrom. And so by helping him out, by giving him some money and food and so on, he was willing to teach the five of us the necessities, which included English. And the way it was done, again, it was ingenious. You couldn't teach anybody, especially Jewish kids. And if they caught you, you'd have a big problem on hands. So my mother and another lady went to a Jewish shoemaker who had an attic above his little store. It was really a house, but he had a front specializing in shoe repair. And they arranged in the attic a couple of long benches with a table. And the idea was that when we were taking instructions 3 or 4 hours a day, he downstairs would work, and if he saw any client coming in, especially the Jewish police or even Polish police used to come fix shoes there, he would hit with his hammer a metal awl that they usually have to work with shoes. He would give us a 3 knock signal, and we would keep totally quiet until he gave us a single signal that it is safe to again go into it. This is how my mother prophesied that English would be a necessity if we live.
Did she speak English?
No. Yiddish, Polish, and fluent in German, because we lived on the border of Germany. Well, from there the story goes that in late 41, 42, Wolbrom was to become Judenrein. And the gendarmerie, which was the German police, there was no army, but just the German gendarmerie and the Polish police, was to organize evacuation for a certain time, a couple of days. In the morning, we had to assemble at the railroad tracks station. And the SS would be then taking over. Again, my mother thought that was not a good idea. And the people my aunt lived with were elderly Jewish people. They owned the house. And they had an attic that was only accessible from the outside through the roof. So the night before the deadline, we climbed up into that roof. My mother, her sister, myself, and my cousin, which was maybe 6 months younger than me, and the old folks that owned the building. Through a very tall ladder from the outside, we crawled in.
Where was your dad? Where
My
was your
father and my uncle went down to the railroad as needed, as requested by the Germans, and they felt that if we are saved, one day they'll come back. They're needed for work. Well, about noon the next day, from what I understood, there was the chief of police, of the Jewish police in Wolbrom, was someone that came from Chorzow as well. And he remembered my father done a lot of charities. And he knew my father. And he walked up to my father and says, "Where is Ethel? Where is your son?" And he had no choice but to tell him. He says, "Mayor," that was his father's name, "if you want them alive, you tell me exactly where they are. I personally will bring him. For you, I'll do it." And he did walk over to the SS and told him that a relative of his has to be brought down. They couldn't make it, and whatever excuse he gave them, he sent a soldier and an SS man and another one, and they accompanied, Geller was his name, the chief of police. They came and knocked on the roof because my father told him how to enter this. And he calmed us down by calling my mother's name and saying, "Mayor sent me to pick you up, don't worry, you're safe." And we climbed down the ladder and we walked. It was about 2 kilometers to the railroad station. And obviously the older people couldn't walk like we did. And the German kept shouting, "Los, mach, dass ihr weiterkommt," and so on. And finally, we heard 2 shots. They shot the 2 old people. They couldn't keep up with us. And my mother says, "Don't turn around, because that's the last thing that you would see." I never did turn around. I walked to the railroad station. And here comes a tragic moment in my life. We stood, my mother, my aunt, my cousin, and myself. And my mother realized that my father and all the body-able men were on the other side. And all this is very old and sick and very young. Again, her wisdom told her what to do, and that's why I'm here. I still can't comprehend. My mother steps out of the row, approaches a German SS man, which was deadly. You do not address a German unless he asks you something. And in perfect German, Plattdeutsch, which is a very high German, reports that this young fellow here ran from over there. He doesn't belong here. The man takes out his whip out of his boots and start beating me up. "Mach, dass du da rüber kommst, los," and start beating me. I should run over there, and I do. But for days, I couldn't figure out. My mother could watch a German beating me up because she told him that I belong over there. And eventually I realized what it meant. She knew. This is for life, and this is for death. 4 days later, she and her sisters and my little cousin was gassed by fumes in Belzec. And the reason I know it is we got through a cousin of my mother's. By the way, Belzec is only 7 kilometers from Niemirov, where my mother was born. And a cousin who was still there saw the train, and he heard the screams and the name Schall, which was my mother's maiden name. He wrote to my original residence to Wolbrom, which we no longer were able to enter, but the story goes on. But we found a letter eventually saying that Ethel, Shever, and Ada were taken to Belzec. And I recently visited Belzec. I know the end that came in Belzec. But now to continue, we wound up in Plaszow, Julag I. That was the camp that built the camp that most people know from Schindler's List. We built the other camp, Julag II, the second Julag. So Plaszow I is where we landed, right from the railroad tracks into a wooden barrack and a fence, not an electric fence, just a fence with 4 towers. I think the total was there about 600 people. And from Wolbrom was maybe 100, 150 people, which I was in. And because of my uncle's brother, who was already there in Julag I, he was the secretary who kept the paperwork for how many people came in, and who was to go to carpentry and so on to build the barrack. He immediately latched on to me because of my knowledge of the German language and represented me to Oberscharführer Miller, who became my boss. I cleaned the shoes. I also cleaned the Ukrainian guards that had a separate barrack. And I never went to work. My father and my uncle did. But all I was is 13, 14 years old. And because I spoke German, Miller has used me for all sorts of things because they couldn't stand Yiddish being spoken instead of German, because most of the people could only speak Yiddish. They couldn't speak German.
Do you know about what year that was? What year?
42. Because shortly after that, I got the permit from Oberscharführer Miller to take my father and go back to Wolbrom to get some clothing. He told me I'm walking in rags. I said, sure. I was taken like that, and that's what I have. And he sort of trusted me. He gave me a written paper that me and my father can go to Wolbrom to pick up clothes, and we are to report in within 10 days, which was very unusual. And yes, we did go to Wolbrom. But 2 days later, that's how we got the card, the postcard that the cousin sent, that he saw my mother and her sister going to Belzhatz. And no sooner we were there, a day or two, we gathered a few things. By the way, nobody broke into that room that we had. I expected that, well, my father mentioned, who knows if there's anything going to be left there. But it was only a few days, so nothing was touched, really. And we were told there was a group of workers, Jewish workers, with Jewish police supervision. They were cleaning up all these apartments and houses into a general point where all the Jewish goods were supposed to be accumulated. We were told by that police that tomorrow morning, together with all the workers, we have to assemble again at the railroad station. That was the end. Everything was cleaned up. There was no necessity for us. My father says, we're not going back there. We're going to die from a bullet, not from starvation and work. And so we hid, of all places, in the attic of a little synagogue that was still standing. And we heard everybody was evacuated at night. It was so quiet. My father says, you know what, we better start walking towards Krakow, because there is a ghetto there, and we have a chance of surviving there. So we crawled out of the attics, and we start walking towards Krakow. The next little town, it was a town, called Słomniki. I couldn't keep up anymore. We walked half the night, and I couldn't keep up anymore. So towards the morning, we reached the outskirts of Słomniki. And my father said, you know what, there is a barn here. We'll crawl in and lay down the straw, you rest a little, then we'll continue. So we went up to the door of the barn, and all of a sudden somebody says, "Stój bo strzelam," hold or I'll shoot. We turn around, a young Polish man, didn't have a gun, nothing, but he screamed at us. I still remember his name, Wilczyk. Wilczyk comes up to my father, says, "What are you guys doing here?" And my father says, "Look, I might as well tell you. My son is not able to continue. We're Jews. We want to get to the ghetto in Krakow, but he has to take a rest. So the man let us in. We stayed there 3 or 4 hours. And my father went down. I don't know how he done this, but he spoke to him a few minutes, and the guy says, okay. He took a horse and buggy, like a hay wagon with straw in it. And he says, you better wear your bands, because if you don't have your band on, not only you will be shot, but I will be shot too. So we had the Star of David on a white armband. And we were sort of submerged in the straw, so if you didn't look too close, you didn't see the armband. And he drove us to the door, to the gate of the Krakow ghetto. My father wanted to pay him, he wouldn't take any money. However, he had a bundle of złotys. He shoved it under his seat. And he advised my father, there was Polish police and there was Jewish police when you entered the gate. He says, when you show the passport to the Jewish policeman, to the Polish policeman who was first, put a 50 zloty bill in there and just give him the passport. And exactly what he said. He took the 50 zlotys, led us through to the Jewish police. The Jewish police had no choice but to let us in. And that's how I wound up in the ghetto of Krakow.
Now, you had the pass from Mueller. You had the pass from Mueller.
No, that's not the pass. The Polish passport he showed.
I see, but
The Miller pass would only let me back to Plaszow. I didn't go back there.
but the fact that you weren't going back on that pass, did that...
Oh, he would have shot us if he found us.
Okay, that's...
Yeah. We wound up in the ghetto. And in order to get the rations, my father found work in the Shotkarnia, which is, we made brushes for the soldiers, for polishing boots, for cleaning clothes. It was from pre-war. The Salzman brothers had a factory. And in the ghetto, it was established a workshop. The Germans were glad to get this, and in fact, they saw that the Polish would supply straw for making scrub brushes and hair from horses to make polishing brushes. And we were there not very long, a few months, and the ghetto started being liquidated.
Was this still 42? What year?
Yes, 42. That's when the Krakow ghetto was eliminated eventually. But it was in groups. And one of the first groups, my father and I were sent to Julag II. That's the Schindler one, the one we originally built. But Miller was no longer there. There was somebody who was an underling under Miller. I forget his, I think it was Heineke. He was just a Scharführer, not an Oberscharführer. And when he recognized me, he says, "Was machst du hier? What are you doing here?" I says, "Well, I was in the ghetto and they shipped me." He was transferred. Miller, Oberscharführer, was taken to the East Front, but this underling was attached to what eventually became my big boss, Obersturmbannführer Goth. He's famous for what he did. But anyways, he in turn, Heineke, has introduced me to Goth and told him that I used to be the houseboy for Miller. He says, "He speaks German? Bring him." And so when he met me, that was it. I became king. I didn't have to go to work. The odd time he would even give me a piece of bread to give it to my father. And I walked through the gates to the villa where Goth was living and back into camp without being checked or anything. And that went on for a year and a half.
What did you do for Goth?
I brushed his dog, Wolf. I cleaned his convertible. His boots had to shine like, he had 2 pair of them. Actually, when he was away, and that happened quite often, I was staying with my father. For nights I always slept with my father in the barracks. But when Get was away, I would stay with my father and go to the Birstenbinderei, the people who still made brushes in Julag II. From the ghetto they transferred the factory to Julag II, which was Plaszow Jerozolimska, because it stood on the street known as Jerozolimska, from the word Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been a lot of times with my father in the factory, because I wouldn't be in the villa if he wasn't there. So I stood with my father, and we were told there was one selection where the kids were taken away, and there was another selection, they needed some workers. But one day, Get said to me, nächste Woche, next week, you and your father will go direct nach Deutschland. You go directly to Germany. I didn't know what that meant, but the big boss says that's what we'll do. And yes, he made sure that we were one of the 200 people selected to go to Gross-Rosen, which was a concentration camp, but not an extermination camp. There's a difference. There was no gas chambers like Auschwitz or Treblinka or Majdanek. And he saw to it that we went straight to Gross-Rosen, and Gross-Rosen had sub-camps, work camps. And the one I wound up with my father was Wolfsberg. The job we did there, from where I have my arthritis, was cutting wet torf grass into squares, piling them up, and eventually they would use those piles for fuel in trucks that would burn the methane gas or whatever it was. And this was our job. We were cutting the wet grass, the mud. And one day I just collapsed, and the arthritis got so bad that my father asked permission. By the way, we didn't have very many SS. Most of it, this whole work camp was organized, Organisation Tot. They had brown uniforms, and they were not killers, but you couldn't escape. There was no place to go. And so my father asked permission, and he carried me back into camp.
About how long were you in Plaszow as the houseboy for Amon Goth?
Forget, must have been a year, maybe a little more.
And you stayed in the barracks every night with your father?
Yes. There was no other accommodation. I had to go back.
And did you have contact with other people when you were in his home, in the villa?
There was 2 women. One was a Polish woman who spoke the odd time, and there was a Jewish girl who was doing the floor washing and stuff like that, but she was only when requested she would come in. She wasn't there all the time. The Polish woman was all the time. And I was there all the time when Get was in. When Get was out, he had all kinds of things. He had a girlfriend, and he traveled to Germany, and sometimes with his wife, sometimes the wife didn't come with him. But he was, I would say, 2-3 days away, then he would be a week in, and so on.
And what did you do when you were not in the villa, when you were back in
I went back to the Stadtkarnia with my father and attended the regular shifts with my father. In fact, I have been known to be very good in drilling the holes for the brushes. So there was 3 or 4 other men who did it, but they were always short in the men. So I used to more or less help out doing that, drilling holes in the brushes for the German military use.
Was your father off? Did he have protexia because of your position?
Well, first of all, he had food because of me. I brought some bread. And yes, I had a lot of push, whether it was the kitchen or whether the Jewish police. There's only one only time, when somebody laid a hand on me, and it was by accident. A famous Jewish rabbi, Rabbi Finkelstein in Krakow, had a son who was a lieutenant in the Jewish police in Plaszow, a real Auswurf, some low life, very bad-mannered, the way he spoke. Anyways, one night he popped into the barracks looking for some volunteers. He pulled people off there was 3 stages.
Bunks.
Bunk beds, yeah, 3 stages. I happened to be on the 2nd floor with my father, and he said, "Get up, you dogs," and whatever he called us. And with the whip, he didn't know who was lying there, just anybody. He cut my brow. I still have a mark here. He didn't know what to do. Once I jumped off thinking he noticed who I am. He didn't know what to do. But he was a lowlife and no good. Anyhow, I know that him and the chief of police and the wife of the chief of police personally hung them before Plaszow was liquidated. So there's one case where I think somebody got what he deserved.
And how did you learn about that?
I've been told by other survivors. I think it was girlfriends of my wife who were in Plaszow, because I was taken out in 1943, late 43, and went to Gross-Rosen and Wolfsberg. And then in Wolfsberg again, somebody looked over me. Must have been my mother. From the arthritis, I wound up in the barracks where there was a sick revier. A revier was like an ambulatory, maybe 6 or 8 beds. And there was a Jewish doctor, Dr. Price from Lodz, a young man. And he meshed up some aspirins or ASA, some compound he used to feed me twice a day, and had another man who was there with an injury put hot bricks on my feet to make me to be able to move. And it was very dangerous for him and for anyone who stayed there more than 2 weeks, because once a month or once every 6 weeks from Auschwitz, a commission came in, like a medical man and an assistant, and they would come in and ask, "What's wrong with this guy? What's wrong with this guy?" And Price used to tell them, well, with me it was a case of verstauchten Fuß. I had a twisted ankle or something, and I'll be better in a week or so. So he smuggled me through, but eventually he got me into the kitchen to be a potato peeler, because I was sitting down. And as time went by, I became the chief potato peeler, because every day a few more people came in from the Schonung, which means not hard work, just something that they would do and peel potatoes for the kitchen. And I was there maybe 4 or 5 weeks.
And where was your father?
My father went to work regular as he did before, but he would see me every evening, and by that time I got quite well acquainted with the cooks who were Hungarian Jews, and by the way, that's where I learned my first Hungarian. And I used to be able to give my father a few raw potatoes and sometimes a soup. So that was pretty good, until they decided the Russians were getting too close. Because Gross-Rosen is in Germany, but not that far away from Silesia, which is the border to Poland.
But you were in the subcamp of Gross-Rosen.
Subcamp of Gross-Rosen was Falkenburg,
Right.
Wolfsberg, a few of those small camps.
And you were in more than one?
No, I was only in that one.
Only in Falkenburg?
Yeah, that's the only one I was in.
So you
but
were
I
not in
know-
Wolfsberg?
No.
Okay.
We knew people that came to the same jobs
I
that
see.
came from Wolfsberg. But they made us first on a ramp. We traveled 3 or 4 days by train. And then the railroads were bombed. Not our train, but the railroads
Now,
were.
when was this?
It was late 44. And then we marched for days on end. A lot of people on the road that just fell to the side and were shot, left. And most of the time we were exposed to the weather. Once in a while we had barns to stay overnight. But at the final stages, must have been December of 44, we wound up on a train, a cattle wagon. And what was left of our group was transported right up to the ramp, which is a kilometer or so from Bergen Belsen. And we were unloaded and marched into Bergen Belsen. We were one of the very, very few that were there, because there used to be a training camp for German soldiers, and then they converted to a camp for people who had passports
An exchange camp?
for
For a foreign
privileged
country,
people.
right.
And then it became the women's camp. And finally, it became a camp for anything that they had to get away from the Russians. And it swelled to over 50,000 people eventually, but not when we came. There was very few. And we wound up in Block 26. My father and myself, and nobody chased us to work. A few people who volunteered to bring in a kettle of soup or whatever. But we were chased out every morning, 4 or 5 in the morning, to line up, to be counted. And then we were given an hour or two outside and then back into the barracks. And people were dying by the thousands. From typhoid, starvation, dysentery, all kinds of sicknesses. And there were skeletons. There was no longer people walking around. And
Do you ever remember having a conversation with your father at this point? What were you all?
my father was practically have that for the last week. But one night, 3 nights before the liberation, we had little windows at the top of the roof line between the end of the wall and the roof. There was little tiny narrow windows for ventilation, I suppose. And he pointed to me and he says, "Do you see all these sparks and lightnings?" I says, "Yeah." He says, "This is the end of Hitler. Stay alive." And in the morning he was gone. That was 3 nights before the liberation. And I sank down into the straw sack, and I was practically I don't know whether it was a faint or whether I was in a coma. But I remember after they dragged my father out to a pit that was between, I later found out, between our block and 24, there was a big ditch. They threw all the bodies in. That's where my father wound up. I was lying there, I don't know, 2 or 3 days. We were already liberated, and I wasn't aware of nothing. And then I saw 2 people in uniform asking me, "You speak English? You speak English?" And I looked up, half there, and I was worried. I thought maybe those are Germans, just pretending they're not Germans, because they wore uniforms. And then a man who I know lived in New York afterwards, his name was Mallinger. He came from Plaszow somehow to Bergen Belsen. And he knew that I spoke English, because my father used to say he learned English because his mother wanted him to know, and this and that. You know, talk. And Mallinger pointed out he was up and around because he came late. I was already in Bergen Belsen more than a month, maybe 6 weeks. I was half dead. But Mallinger was still up and around, and he pointed at me. And then when I didn't want to say anything, Mallinger says, "Nie bój się, to są Anglicy, don't be afraid. These are English soldiers." And so I finally got convinced, yes. And so I said, "Yes, I do speak some English." They took me out into an ambulance, fed me intravenous. I was cared like you wouldn't believe, twice a day a doctor, and there was always an attendant. And eventually, within a week or so, I was able to make announcement in 3 languages through a big speaker on top of the ambulance. And I lived in that ambulance for a few weeks until the end of the death camp, and I was transferred to what was at the time a training camp for the Germans, which we now regard as Bergen Belsen, but that was the living camp. The original Belsen, the death camp, is where I started.
Did you witness the destruction of that camp by the British?
I was, because I was in that ambulance, I was eventually transferred with, there was a special 5th British Corps officers who gave the order to take flamethrowers and burn the barracks. I have pictures of those burned barracks, which I didn't take then. I didn't have a camera or anything, but I went back later to take those pictures. And yes, I was on the last truck out, and I could see through the back of the truck, like they burned them with flamethrowers, and nothing was left. A few chimneys stood. It was all ashes. And it was a good thing, because the typhoid was terrible. People died. Half of the people from the 50,000 died after the liberation. Some of it even after a year or so in Bergen Belsen, there was a discussion whether by being good they done more harm. I remember British lorries came in, and I made an announcement. Food can be picked up between the ladies' camp and the men's camp at kitchen number so-and-so. They came with dump trucks full of Spam and all these cans, and would lift the gate and dump it. And the people, they were hungry, they were wild. They would eat this meat the way it was. Their stomachs weren't ready for it. A lot of people died of dysentery. But they tried to do the best they could.
Did you witness the digging of the mass graves and the burials?
Not only the digging, I've seen some of the front loaders pushing bodies in. There was, I don't see how there was any other way, and they used some sort of a liquid, I think it was calcium or something, to disinfect the area after they moved the dead. Yeah, and one of them is my father. I went to see it 10 years ago. I was there.
You knew which grave he was in? You knew which grave he was in?
Yes, he was in the smallest one, 2,000 people. And I know more or less the location according to the blueprint I have here, where we were located, 24 and 26, it was in between. And there's a grave more or less in that location.
Who went with you when you went back there?
My wife, my daughter, and her husband, Dr. Aaron Jessen. We spent almost 2 weeks. We first flew in to Krakow. We visited Plaszow. I took them, then I arranged for a car. It was driven to Chorzow, where I was born. I showed them the store of my parents and the place I grew up. I showed them the school I went to. And then we went to Radom, city where my wife was born. And again, we showed them, and I saw it for the first time where she came from. I had never been in Radom before.
Did you have any conversations with the people who lived there while you were there?
One very unpleasant one in Radom. I almost wound up in jail. We were standing in what was the city square, and my wife was trying to explain to me and my daughter and my son-in-law that where that grass is sort of different was a monument to the unknown soldier, which we found out later was removed during the Russians. They didn't want any nationalism, so they removed it. And she was describing, this is where the uncle used to live, and that's where they used to live. And all of a sudden, about, 50 feet away, in a house on the steps, 3 young Polish guys were smoking. And one turns around and says, te Żydy przyszli po swoje majątki, psia krew cholera, which means those stinking Jews came to get their houses back or something like that. I grabbed the camera I had in my hand and wrapped it around, a movie camera, and I started out towards them. My son-in-law grabbed me by the back and he says, Dad, we have a plane to catch. You're going to wind up in jail. And he calmed me down. That was one of the conversation, but that wouldn't have been so bad because they tried to appease me. He's young, they don't know nothing, they just hooligans. My wife says, don't get upset, but instead of this, let's go into City Hall and I'll get my birth certificate. And sort of calmed me down and went in and we stood in line. And there was 3 or 4 people ahead of us. Finally, I get to the desk and explain to the woman there that I'm trying to get the birth certificate. And she says, oh, sorry, but anything that's more than 10 years ago, the certificates would be in Warsaw. And she writes me out the address and everything, very polite. And I says, it's amazing. It's about time that your people shouldn't allow. And I told her the incident with those young people. And she calms me down. She says, there's hooligans in every nation, in every country. Don't pay attention to them. And again, I'm sort of calmed down and figured, maybe she's right. Maybe I'm oversensitive. And I thanked her and I turn around. By the way, the conversation was in Polish. Turn around and start walking out. And the 3rd or 4th woman in the lineup, which is not a youngster anymore, she was in her 30s or 40s, says to me as I walk by, I am not surprised the greetings you got from these people, because when we come to America, we don't get any better treatment. The woman thought that I'm from America. although I was from Canada, but the way we were dressed and cameras and all that. And then I stopped and I thought, you know what? This is not an incident that happened outside. This is a mature woman. And so in all the calmness I had, I turned around and says, you know what? Till now, when a Pole came to the factory and he needed a job and couldn't speak anything but Polish, he was sent to me to give him a job. But I promise you, from now on, no Pole gets a job in my factory. And that was the end of that conversation. That was the experience I had. And I must recognize that Wilczek did help us to get to the Krakow ghetto from his barn. So you had two kinds. But the majority acts like those young punks and that woman.
We're going to take a break now. Change the tape.
So I'll
Would
take
you
a
like
drink
something to
of
drink?
whiskey. Do you see this? You know who this is? That's me.
The English translator.
You know what it says here? Police camp interpreter.
Can we? Yeah.
Which is the better looking one?
So that was 45, so you were 18 years old.
And married.
In this picture.
Well, maybe 2 months later.
Are we rolling?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yes, I was liberated, and I felt obliged to the liberators to pay back. So my first payback was in the ambulance, making announcements. And then eventually I wound up in GB 6, which was the administrative building in Bergen Belsen. I was more or less the liaison between the British, the Jewish police, and the Bergen Belsen committee, the Jewish committee, which was very, very active. And I think it was a gathering point for all these little camps that were in the British zone, people who were lucky enough to be saved during the Russians in Russia, and some hidden people who came out and had no homes where to go. They came to Bergen Belsen because Bergen Belsen was that well organized. There was people like Yossel Rosensaft, Trapman. The whole committee was people who were a little older than me, and they were definitely people who believe in organization. I know of some of these people were so dedicated that I don't think Aliyah or any of the British restrictions that existed against Palestine would have finally taken place and finally be abolished if it wasn't for these people, Chamo Poslushny, Trapman, and again, Yasser Rosa was so dedicated that small in stature, but he was a giant. He would walk around with a pad and pencil and ask for the name, where you came from, and organize lists of survivors. And because of him, an aunt that survived was 2 boys, my cousins, my aunt Shpiegler, my mother's sister, survived in Siberia and came to a camp in Bavaria where she found my name because Yossele took all these names and finally communicated with me. And by that time I was already the interpreter. I had all kinds of access. So I had a car, drove down to, I think it was called Wieste-Giesdorf, a small town in Bavaria, where people who came across from Austria and from Hungary were located. And I picked up my aunt and the two boys and brought them to Bergen Belsen. And eventually, that aunt and the two boys went to Israel with Aliyah Bet, all organized through the Jewish Brigade and the diligence of people like Yehezkel and Trepman and Plaszow. There was a few more people, I don't exactly remember all their names, but Dr. Bimko, a woman who done so much. And these two boys, unfortunately both died, but left me great cousins, which I'm in touch with in Israel and very proud of. Yes, Bergen Belsen was a very important place, not only because my father died there and my wife's mother died there, but because Jewish life came back. The rebirth occurred because of Bergen Belsen. My two little cousins, one was 7, one was 8 and 9, went to a school in Bergen Belsen for the little time that they were there, from 46, 47 to 49. Those couple of years they attended school. And it was all because it was that well organized.
Tell us about meeting your wife, if you wouldn't mind.
Oh, yeah. No sooner I was on my feet and start to work as the official interpreter for the camp, I ran into a group of girls. There was 4 or 5 of them, including my wife, who lived a block across from where I was living. And my roommate, who was older than me, met one of the 4 girls and finally said to me, you know what? They know how to cook potatoes. Maybe you can organize, because I had all these connections, some margarine or maybe butter. We'll have dinner there. I says, well, over there with the girls? He says, yeah. Why? I says, well, I can go to the British canteen and eat. He says, yeah, but don't you want to meet with our people? And so this is how I got to know the girls across the street. And finally, that one there somehow was very nice. And we created the first wedding in Bergen Belsen. Rabbi Wolbrom was the Hungarian rabbi, of whose ketubah I still have. And
What month do you remember? What day?
I better remember.
Okay, well, when was it?
It was in August.
August of?
Yeah, of 46.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, I have a certificate to prove it. Yeah, it's been 61 years almost. But
can you describe that day in a little more
yes,
detail?
yes, I can. I got involved with another fellow, Leo Weinberg, not Weisberg, Weinberg, who was from, I think, Jaloszyce in Poland, but he wound up. He was a very clever man, and he says, Sam, you have the connections. I could bring in from the German side some pop, some fruits. We don't get that. We get the soup and bread, in the canteen that was by the government, by UNRWA. United Nations organized food for us, but we don't get any of those extras. We do get cigarettes, we get coffee, and for cigarettes and coffee, the Germans will sell you their grandmother. So we could bring in stuff and trade, and you would have no trouble through the gate. And sure enough, that's how it started. We opened a canteen inside. He was the business end, and I was the smuggling end. I brought in the stuff, and we done a terrific business. And slowly, we come to the conclusion that without those two girls, his girlfriend and what became my girlfriend, there's really nothing we're doing right. So we took the advice of some people, mostly older than we were. He was older than me, but not that older. And we were told, listen, you ought to get married. And we did. We had a double wedding in Bergen Belsen, and unfortunately he's gone by now, but his wife is around in Israel. And we had a double wedding, which was really something unusual again, because of my connections of buying fruits, vegetables, and the pop that I brought into the camp. I got to know a few Germans. I can't guarantee how good they were during Hitler's days, but when I needed something, there was no limit. So my wife got a fur coat, a present from Mr. Kota, a German. He was a big dealer in Bergen, that's the city. And then we had one in Soltau, which was another little town. They brought us all kinds of stuff for the wedding. He even delivered in his truck, which I had permission to bring in, little palm trees to decorate for our wedding for the chuppah. By the way, we had a regular chuppah made out of a tablecloth or something with 4 sticks from brooms, and we had a regular chuppah and a wedding in Bergen Belsen in August of 46. That was the first wedding, a double wedding that I know of.
Could we start looking at some of your photographs and documents?
Well, this is my wife's pride and joy. She says, that's what did it. And the sign on my armband says, police, camp interpreter. And then as we progressed, the Jewish brigade came in, and when they saw me and spoke to me, they gave me a new cap. This is a British cap, but the Jewish brigade belonged under the British. So I got the cap, and I was very proud of it. I also promised that I will show you some of the photos that I took probably in 47. These are the remnants of, I think I better take these out, of Belsen. Here is one reminder. See the SS gate? This was one of the entries to the old camp, but everything else was in ashes after the flamethrowers destroyed it all. And thank God they did.
Is there too much? No, that looks good.
This is a mass grave. I think that's the one where my father is. This is all that was left. There should be on one of the pictures a chimney of the crematoria. And when I say crematoria, it was just a single oven. There was no gas chamber or anything like that. This is after the liberation, the protest about the Exodus.
Now, did you take these pictures as well?
I took all the square ones are made with a German camera called a robot. I think there's the chimney.
Mm-hmm.
It's not easy to see, but the chimney is on this picture. Way back there. Yeah, that's the chimney. This is the demonstration against the Exodus.
You know, there's a little glare on that because of the angle. I think that's better. I'll hold it. There we go. Did you take this one as well?
Yes,
And
first babies.
Yeah. And this is one of the barracks?
As a matter of fact, that is my wife walking to the barrack where we lived.
Okay, and this one with the Hebrew writing is a Rosh Hashanah card.
Yeah.
Can we get that one, Jude?
In the background is GB6. That's the place where the Jewish police operated from, and the British command was in there. And I was there once in a while.
Now, was that that was a printed New Year's card?
Yeah.
L'Shana Haba?
Yeah, we took it to Bergen where it was
Shana
printed.
Tova,
Yeah.
Hmm.
And these are the Shpiegler boys, whom I told you, the two little boys that
Your
I brought.
cousins. Yeah.
And they came to Bergen Belsen to see where we were liberated years later. This is in its 50s.
And
Now,
is
wait,
that you in the
went
middle?
there?
Sorry?
Is that you in the middle?
No. Those are the boys from Israel. They went there.
And who is the person in the middle? Can you see who that is?
No, I can't
No.
tell. And this is something Yehezkel Rosendahl made sure that a monument of all the Jewish dead would stay there. That's in Hebrew.
And who's in front?
That's still there. I've seen it. A Jewish policeman. I've been there 10 years ago. That's still there. But now there's a huge monument, enormous. I was impressed. See, here's the chimney.
Yeah. This.
Here is a rare book in 3 languages: Hebrew, Yiddish, and English. 1946.
Can we get? It's Trapman, Rosenthal, and Olevsky. So it's mostly a narrative. Oh, here.
Did you get that book
Sorry?
in 46? Have you had it? Or
Did I have it in 46? Yes.
So how was it distributed?
Anyone in the committee, in the leadership, would have a book. I don't think there's any more left. Look at this one.
I can't read what it says.
What are we looking at in this picture?
This is showing the destruction of different, I think that's the Lodz ghetto right there. The history of our, as the title says, of our disaster is described in this book, but later on it shows some of the liberated Jews too. And these are the pictures that...
That's an amazing book.
That's quite extraordinary, and it's in very good condition. You saved it beautifully. Let's show the last page. I want to hold this. I want to get
Some of these people came to Bergen Belsen too.
These were partisans.
Yeah.
I imagine most of these books are in museums now.
I would hope so.
Yeah.
But this is one of the first editions. 1946, this book was
Yeah, December.
printed.
Very early.
One of them has the uniform of a Polish soldier there. There again, the front one in the middle is a Polish soldier.
What other treasures do you have in that?
And then other tragedies. Speaking of tragedies,
Well, that's the one that you were telling us about. Yeah.
my wife's cousin, first line cousin, 10 years old. Here is his name, Mark Steinbaum. The British were 4 kilometers from Hamburg where this was done. His sister was born in Memmingen. I was there. This is 1947, 48. She's now over 60s, yeah. 47, 48. When she was born in Memmingen, I arrived there at night. The next morning, my wife's uncle, which is the father to this one, and the father to the one that I was witnessing when the nurse, it was a nun that brought the baby out to us and to the father. Lola Steinbaum today is a director of a clinic in California. She is a miracle on its own. She has 2 graduate university boys and has 2 5-year-old twin boys, which will be tonight visiting me in Toronto. A mother of 61 gave birth at 57, a pair of twins. So everybody says, how is it possible? A very simple explanation. She's a very well-known doctor, and she is the chief of a clinic, so she knows how to do it. We're very proud of that, but we all pay the price. And so I, from time to time, sit there and I balance it. Thank God, my daughter gave me 6 grandchildren. 3 girls and 3 boys, because she has a PhD in genetics. She knows how to do that. And as a consequence, I am now very, very rich and proud. I have 5 great-grandchildren.
Kanahara.
They're in Israel, but they come to visit me. I probably will see them this summer again. And yes, you have to balance it. Did we pay too much for it? Who knows the answer? I don't. Yeah. We have to be very careful. I will never forget the instance. And I'm saying it now because I want it to be on record. I was about 8 or 9 years old in Silesia. We were very advanced for those days in Poland. Streetcar, going back and forth through the border, radio, even a telephone in the store. We didn't have one at the house. And I was fluent in German because that's how I was brought up. I listened to a speech of Adolf Hitler. And he shouts and screams, and finally I heard the sentence, Ich werde sämtliche Juden in Europa ausrotten. Sieg Heil! I shall annihilate all Jews in Europe. I said, what? In Europe? That means Poland too. So I ran down the store and I said to my mother, Mutti, that's in German, did you hear what the Führer said? He was getting very popular. This is 38, 39. And my mother says, what's the matter with you, child? This is Germany over there. We have a democracy in Poland. Don't be concerned about it. It can never happen here. It didn't take a year. I found out how long it took. And what I'm saying to whoever is listening to me, we have another Hitler going. Who says it? I shall go after the Americans and I shall go after the Israel. He is openly saying those words in a little different fashion than Adolf Hitler said, Ich werde sämtliche Juden in Europa ausrotten. He tried, he almost succeeded. Let's not happen this again. Let's not allow it to happen. People should not be so apathetic, well, it's over there, let them kill each other. It eventually comes. All these poor American and British and other nations who gave their sons to liberate Europe. Why? Because we let Hitler go too far. And any cancer that's left alone for too long is deadly. That's my opinion.
Well, we thank you very much for making this trip and sharing your memories with us today.
I think I did my duty and will do so anytime that I'm requested to do it. I do it in Toronto, in schools, even to people like the police force. But what I personally think that you people who organize it, who do it, you are doing a mitzvah. I am doing an obligation. You're doing a mitzvah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm assuming the Bergen Belsen